Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a really close look at a legal saga that, well, it captured everyone's attention. The case against music mogul Sean Diddy Combs, the conviction, the sentencing on October 3rd, 2025, huge news. But if you just read the headlines, you probably missed the most interesting part. The legal tension right at the center of it all. Our job today is to get past that noise and really understand the specific mixed verdict the jury came back with and why the judge, Arun Subramanian, gave him that controversial 50-month sentence. That's what, 4 years, 2 months? Even though Combs was cleared of the biggest charges.
Exactly. That mixed verdict is key. The whole thing really turned on this quite old but still powerful federal law, the Mann Act. We really need to break down this law, look at its, frankly, troubling history, and see how it's being used today in a case like this involving a celebrity, power dynamics, all of that.
Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe we should start with just a basic legal scorecard. What did the prosecution initially throw at him versus what actually stuck? Because they started big, right?
Oh, absolutely big. The initial indictment was, well, sweeping. They were trying to paint a picture of Combs as the head of this large criminal operation. So you had racketeering conspiracy, arquico, the kind of thing used against organized crime. Then 2 counts of sex trafficking, 2 counts of transportation for prostitution, and then other things tacked on, like arson, attempted kidnapping, aiding sex trafficking.
Wow, that is a laundry list. But it sounds like maybe they knew some of that wouldn't fly. Did some charges get dropped early?
Precisely. Before the trial even started, they dropped the arson, the attempted kidnapping, and the aiding sex trafficking counts. That usually suggests the evidence for those, maybe the more headline-grabbing peripheral charges, just wasn't strong enough. They had to narrow things down for the jury.
Okay, so fast forward through the 8-week trial. The jury deliberates, comes back July 2nd, 2025. And the government's main arguments whiffed. Combs found not guilty of racketeering conspiracy and not guilty of both sex trafficking counts. That seems like a massive rejection of their core case.
It really was the defining moment, legally speaking. The jury just flat out rejected the idea that Combs was running some kind of systematic criminal enterprise based on force or fraud. That narrative the government spent weeks building. The jury didn't buy it.
But they did convict him on 2 counts. The transportation to engage in prostitution charges involving Cassie Ventura and another woman known as Jane. And this is where the Mann Act comes in. Can you just clarify for everyone listening, what's the real difference between sex trafficking and this Mann Act transportation charge? They sound similar.
That's the crucial distinction, and it's easy to blur them. For federal sex trafficking, the prosecution has to prove force, fraud, or coercion. They have to show someone was compelled, tricked, or forced into commercial sex. It's a high bar, focusing on exploitation. The jury clearly said the government didn't meet that specific standard against Combs.
Okay, so trafficking requires that element of force or coercion. What about the Mann Act transportation conviction then?
It's a much lower threshold, legally speaking. For the Mann Act, as it's applied here, you basically need 3 things. 1, someone was transported across state lines. 2, the defendant knew about the transportation. And 3, the defendant intended for that person to engage in prostitution or illegal sexual activity once they got there. So what the jury found was evidence that, yes, Combs knowingly arranged or paid for travel for these women across state lines, and he did so intending that prostitution would happen. They found knowing facilitation. But importantly, by acquitting on trafficking, they signaled they didn't find proof of that systematic force, fraud, or coercion, the stuff that really makes trafficking so heinous and carries those huge potential sentences.
Right, so the jury found a technical violation. He knowingly transported someone for prostitution. But they rejected the bigger story of him being this exploitative mastermind. That's quite nuanced. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. This transportation law, the Mann Act, it carries some serious historical baggage. We're not talking about some modern law designed for today's problems. This thing was passed way back in 1910. And its original name.
The White Slave Traffic Act.
Yeah.
You can't ignore that context.
It came out of this period of intense moral panic about white slavery, which frankly often had racial and xenophobic undertones. And because of that panic, Congress used really broad moralistic language. It outlawed transporting women for prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose. That vague immoral purpose phrase, that was the key. It basically weaponized the law. It allowed it to be used not just against forced trafficking, but as a tool to police social norms, relationships, particularly across racial lines in the early 20th century. And the classic example people always bring up is the boxer Jack Johnson, right? 1913.
Absolutely. Johnson was the first black heavyweight champion. He was unapologetic about his relationships with white women, which flew in the face of the era's racist social codes. So the government went after him using the Mann Act. Not because they suddenly cared about trafficking victims, but to punish him for his relationship with Lucille Cameron, a white woman. They argued transporting her was for an immoral purpose.
Wow. When you hear that history, Johnson, and you mentioned later cases too, like Chuck Berry, even R. Kelly recently faced Mann Act charges alongside trafficking ones. It makes you ask, is this law, born in that specific moral climate, still being used selectively? Is its vagueness a problem when prosecutors are looking for something to stick against a high-profile person, especially if the bigger charges don't pan out?
That's the shadow hanging over the sentencing phase of this case. It really informs the debate about whether the punishment fits the actual crime convicted.
All right, let's get to that. The 50-month sentence. Judge Subramanian gives him 4 years, 2 months, plus that big $500,000 fine. Now, the maximum he could have gotten was 20 years, so 50 months is way below that ceiling. Still, Combs' team immediately called it excessive.
Why? Well, and a lot of legal observers kind of raised an eyebrow, too, based purely on the convictions. Their main point is the acquittal on the really serious stuff, RAO and sex trafficking. If you look at typical sentences just for Mann Act transportation, especially involving consenting adults where there's no coercion proven, you're usually looking at probation, maybe 2 or 3 years max. 50 months felt high for just that.
So the defense is basically saying the judge punished Combs for the trafficking and coercion stuff the jury specifically said he didn't do, not just the transportation he was found guilty of. Is that the argument?
That's pretty much it. And it gets into a tricky area of sentencing law. Juries have to find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt of very high standard. But at sentencing, judges have more discretion. They can consider other conduct, including conduct the defendant was acquitted of, if they believe it's proven by a lower standard, called a preponderance of the evidence, basically more likely than not.
Hold on. So the judge can look at all the trafficking testimony the jury heard, decide, yeah, I think it's more likely than not this abusive stuff happened, even though the jury wasn't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, and use that to justify a harsher sentence.
Exactly. The judge can essentially say, okay, the jury didn't find criminal trafficking, but based on everything I heard, I believe there was an abuse of power here, and that justifies going well above the usual sentence for simple transportation. It's a controversial aspect of sentencing flexibility.
Okay. What other reasons did the judge or the prosecution give for why 50 months was appropriate here?
Well, a few key things. First, the pattern. It wasn't just one trip. The convictions involved 2 different women, Cassie Ventura and Jane Doe, suggesting it wasn't isolated, which points towards needing a stronger deterrent. Second, that power imbalance we talked about. Combs' immense wealth and influence in the music industry that was definitely presented as an aggravating factor, abusing that kind of power.
And I imagine his attitude played a role. Lack of remorse, maybe.
That usually does. Reports indicate Combs maintained his innocence throughout the process, didn't really show acceptance of responsibility before sentencing. Judges often reward remorse with leniency, so the absence of it can work against a defendant. Ultimately, Judge Subramanian said the evidence for the transportation convictions themselves was overwhelming, and that the conduct, even without the trafficking label, was serious enough to warrant substantial time.
Makes sense. So the defense is appealing, obviously. What are their main arguments going to be?
2 main prongs, it seems. First, that the 50-month sentence is just substantively unreasonable for these specific transportation convictions. They'll argue it's disproportionate to the crime actually found by the jury. And second, they're going after the judge more directly, alleging procedural errors. They use the phrase acted as a 13th juror, which is strong language. They'll likely point to things like how a juror was dismissed mid-deliberation, or argue that certain instructions or rulings prejudiced the jury against Combs.
This really brings us back to what you called the technical guilt problem.
Yeah.
Where does this case ultimately land on that spectrum of guilt? It seems complicated.
It is complicated. You've got different layers. Legal guilt. Yes, the jury checked the boxes for the Mann Act transportation elements, found him legally guilty of that. Factual guilt. It's messy. They factually found he paid for travel knowing prostitution was the intent. But they factually rejected the government's story of him being a coercive trafficker running an enterprise. And then there's moral guilt. The jury seemed to reject the prosecution's moral narrative about coercion, but the judge, with that 50-month sentence, seems to have factored in the perceived moral wrongness of the alleged abuse of power, even if not criminally proven as trafficking. And that raises the core question. Should knowingly paying for travel for consensual prostitution warrant over 4 years in federal prison?
So what does this all mean when you zoom out? What's the takeaway?
I think this case really highlights that constant tension in the legal system between holding powerful people accountable and ensuring the punishment fits the specific crime proven. The Mann Act was the only tool left after the trafficking charges failed, maybe the only way to achieve some accountability for perceived abuses. But using it this way, with this sentence, stretched the principle of proportionality. The 50 months really does feel like it reflects the shadow of the unproven trafficking allegations.
Yeah, that's the feeling you get. The jury very clearly said no to the big RODCO and trafficking picture the government painted. But the sentence feels like he got punished for that picture anyway, not just the 2 transportation counts.
It definitely sets a potentially tricky precedent.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Considering the Mann Act's specific history being used sometimes for moral policing and the fact the jury explicitly rejected the trafficking charges here, how much leeway should a judge really have to sentence based on allegations the jury didn't find, proven beyond a reasonable doubt? If you're interested, really dig into the Mann Act itself, its wording, and how it's been applied over the decades. Quite a story. Thanks for diving deep with us today.